All right, well, good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know, maybe you've got the email, but uh, you saw it maybe a week ago and then you forgot. So right after service today, we're going to be doing an info class as well. So every so often we'll do that, but that's the time where you come. You can learn about the church, what we believe, what we do, kind of how we're set up, where we're going. For people that want to become members, I can do the membership covenant then as well too. But it's really more of just like an info class of here's what we're about, and we feed you as well, so that's always a plus. So we're going to be doing that right after service. So even if you didn't sign up today, I know we've got a couple families that are signed up. So even if you didn't, though, feel welcome to stay. It's going to be back in the conference room back there. We're in week 3 of Raising Great Kids in a Crazy World. And the first 2 weeks were so simple, right? They're simple to understand, but they're hard to live out in the moment, both for kids and adults. But often when we step back, we're like, yeah, that makes so much sense, right? We have to be led by truth over feelings in our lives. We have to be led by actions over intentions. And so we have to do, the things that we're going to say in life. And so again, we're looking at 4 foundational pillars that if kids have these in their lives, they'll be able to take whatever the world throws at them. And when we don't have these in our lives, we tend to get swept up in the craziness of the world around us. And so the breakdown has again been week 1, but Daddy, I love him. We looked at truth over feelings. Week 2, we looked at, I'll clean my room later. I bet none of your kids ever say that to you, or you never said that to your parents, right? But that was actions over intentions. This week, my phone is better than yours. We're talking about grace over judgment. And then next week, Pastor Brad's going to wrap it up with, I need to buy it, right? And that's going to be, where do we get our identity from? And it's going to be looking at instilling Christ over the world. But again, today we're talking about grace over judgment. And this is so important because today the world is kind of going crazy with judgment, right? People are so quick to judge others. So if you disagree with me about something, then I have to cut you off, right? I have to unfriend you. Or we just can't have a decent discourse anymore, right? If you look a certain way or dress a certain way, maybe people have to shame you, right? If you don't do what I want you to do, or if my food doesn't come fast enough, then I'm going to shame you on social media. And so many people just have lost the sense of how do you even have a basic conversation with someone who thinks different politically than you do, right? And so we just have kind of lost this, and it filters down to our kids as well, where it's so easy and so quick just to start judging other people by maybe the clothes they wear, or what they do, what sports they play or don't play, what they drive, the type of phone they have. It's so easy to be judgmental. Yet, when you look at your own life for a second, do you tend to like those people in your life who are quick to judge you, or those who tend to give you grace, especially when you mess up? So if you make a mistake at work, or not on time, you're running late, do you like the boss that is like, okay, well, I'm going to show you, grace and just go on with your day? Or do you like the one that's like, all right, we need an action plan. Okay, you have some issues, I need to report. We want people that are going to err on the side of giving us grace. And you can probably think of people in your life, maybe it's coaches, maybe it's teachers, maybe it's coworkers, maybe it's bosses, maybe it's spouses. People in your life, though, that have given you grace, even though you've done some amazingly stupid things. And you can probably think of times when other people have judged you or been quick to judge you. Maybe and the things that you did weren't even that big, right? But there's just something about them, right, where they felt compelled to judge you extremely quickly. And then you can also turn that around and probably think about times when you've given grace to others, and maybe times when you have been a little bit quick to judge others as well. But we want grace, and for those people in our lives that tend to show us grace, we tend to return the favor because we remember that. And so we will tell, if you have a boss that sticks up for you, even if you made a boneheaded decision at work, right, and it was your fault and you did something, but if you have a boss that sticks up for you and they have your back no matter what, like you're going to show them grace and you're going to probably give them a favor. You're probably going to go the extra mile for them. And the same is true with our kids' lives as well. If we want people to show them grace and to give them favor, right, because favor will open up doors for them. It will help with relationships in the future, whether it's business, work, whether it's in their families, friendships, whatever it is, right? If we want that for our kids, we have to instill in them an attitude of grace. And I'm not talking about kindness, although kindness is good and you should all be kind. All of our students actually are very kind, so that's great. And I'm not talking just about forgiveness, although forgiveness is good, and we want to instill forgiveness in our kids and students as well, right? Because you don't want to be chained by the past, by hurts of the past, and to bring their past into their future. But I'm talking about grace. And a few weeks ago in Refuge, we spent a number of, 3 weeks just on this concept of grace over judgment. And so we were talking about what's the difference between forgiveness and grace. And forgiveness is really the first part of grace, right? Forgiveness says, I'm going to forgive you, especially if you wrong me, right? I'm going to forgive you. Grace says, not only do I forgive you, but I want something for you as well. Right? So grace goes that extra mile for them. And so as a parent, it might be, you didn't listen to me, but I'm going to forgive you. Grace says, okay, you didn't listen to me. We got it sorted out. I forgive you. Let's go get you ice cream. Now, you can't do that all the time. Other kids will catch on. But, right, it's wanting that extra little bit for them. And we don't talk necessarily about favor a lot, but it's actually in the Bible quite a bit. That God gives his favor to people. So we hear that a lot with Israel or the church. But it also shows that favor with man is important. So in Proverbs 3, it says, my son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments for length of days and years of life, and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. And if you want to think about somebody that lived that out, I think Joseph, we're going to be in Jonah a little bit, that Joseph is a prime example of that. Right? Because we see in his youth that Joseph did have a little bit, like he was almost a little bit on the side of judging, and being like, I'm better than my brothers, right? And that didn't go so well for him. But he stayed faithful to God and to the word. And so it says this about Pharaoh's officials. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he, the official, made him, Joseph, overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had, right? Joseph found favor. And then, of course, we think of Jesus. And so when it talks about how Jesus is growing in Luke, it says Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. Kids to have favor both with God and with other people, because sometimes a person's favor will, again, open doors for you, or they might give you wisdom or sometimes support in various ways. It's so much harder to go through life alone and isolated. But if we raise kids who look down on others and who judge others, like, it's really hard to give those people favor. And so if we want our kids to have great character, and if we want our kids to have favor, then we have to instill an attitude and a character of grace in them. And so we're going to be in Jonah 4 today. So if you have Bibles, you can turn over to Jonah 4. And while you're turning there, to set up where we're going, let me set it up like this. For those of you who are probably 40 and older, if I say the names Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, what movie do you think of? Boom! Perfect. Awesome. Speed, right? And I mean, that was an amazing movie. I saw that movie like a bajillion times, right? It's about a bus that can't slow down. Doesn't sound, too wow on just the face of it, but it was such a fun movie, right? And we remember that movie. And the bus slowed down, right? A bomb would explode on it. And so if you saw it in the theater, it was big because of the action, but there was also in the movie a plot twist. And if you remember, for like 2-3 years, pretty much every movie that came out after Speed copied that formula, where I'd be in a theater and I'd be like, oh, when's the plot twist coming? There it is, right? Like they kind of copied that thing where it was leading you one way, but then at the end, you realized that something else was going on the whole time. Well, Jonah is a story that's a lot like that. We become so familiar with it that we miss or forget that throughout the first 3 chapters, the author is leading us one way, and then in the 4th chapter, the final act, right, there's a plot twist that shows us the actual reality of what's going on here. And so for most people, if we just read the story, or if we're going back to our childhood when we would, draw the whale and color it in and all that, we think that Jonah was all about a disobedient prophet and that he was reluctant, maybe fearful, because God said, I want you to go to Nineveh, to the Assyrians, and I want you to tell them repent, otherwise I'm going to bring judgment upon them. And the Assyrians were pretty brutal people, right? And so we're like, that kind of makes sense that Jonah didn't want to go, that he was afraid, and that he ran the other way, and that he was disobedient. So Jonah runs from God, right? And he runs the opposite direction. He gets swallowed by a whale, and then he finally goes, okay, I will go. And so he goes to Nineveh. The people listen, and they repent. And so for the whole story, we've been led to believe that Jonah is disobedient just because he wanted to be disobedient. But then in the 4th chapter, we read this. But to Jonah, so this is when Nineveh repents. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. He's so upset. But the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry? Jonah didn't disobey because he was inclined to disobedience, and he wasn't reluctant to go to the city or fearful of the Assyrians. Because if God tells any of us to go, I'm guessing most of us aren't going to go because we're afraid. The Assyrians were pretty brutal. They had their own gods. If they were going to come in and destroy a nation, they weren't just going to kill you, they would torture you as well. So they might come in, they might kill a number, but then to others, they would take hooks, run it through your jaws, and lead you out in lines. That's scary. So if God tells you to go to them, you're probably like, ugh. But Jonah wasn't afraid to go. And he wasn't reluctant to go because of how brutal they were. And we know that because God never calls him out on that. He does that with Israel when Israel's afraid to go into the promised land, but not with Jonah. See, Jonah was actually the right person to choose for the job. He wasn't afraid. He was bold, and he was stubborn when he set his mind to something. Some of you have kids that are bold and stubborn when they set their mind. Some of you have kids, some of you are as well, right? And God can use that to do great things. And so Jonah was actually the right person for the job because he wasn't afraid. He's bold and he's stubborn. He set his mind to something. He was the perfect guy for the job. God needed a prophet like Jonah to go in and to tell the city that. But Jonah didn't want to go because he knew God would show them grace over judgment. And Jonah wanted them to experience judgment. And so when we withhold grace and give judgment, we're being more like Jonah than like Jesus. Like, our job is to give grace. God's job is ultimately to give judgment, and we see that in Revelation. Right? That's when that happens. So when somebody wrongs me and my first instinct is judgment, I'm actually overstepping. If I make a snap decision about someone and judge them, I'm overstepping. Because I'm not seeing the person and their humanity and their struggles and frustrations and self-worth. And so don't confuse the roles. And we do. Like, every so often, I mean, my kids are, for the most part, pretty good, right? I'm getting glared at now. But my kids are, for the most part, pretty good. But every so often, right, they don't listen. Just like I didn't listen. Actually, they're better than I was. But then, as parents, we remind them, right, no, we're the parents, you're the adult. It's so easy to confuse roles. And sometimes we do that with God, where we overstep into his role. And when we do that, we get confused. And so how do we help our kids display grace over judgment? Well, surprise, surprise, just like the first 2 weeks, it starts with us. Right? If we want our kids to do and show grace, display grace, see the humanity behind people's eyes, it starts with us and modeling it for them and to them. So how do we do that? We talked about it a little bit last week, but I think first it starts with an easy way to do it is to assume that others are doing the best they can. Because again, very few people in life are probably like, you know what, I just want to see how horrible I can be. Most people are trying to do the best they can. And so maybe at work, your boss is difficult because their boss is holding them accountable for ridiculous metrics. And so they need to pass that on to you. And oftentimes at work, there are conversations that are happening above us that we don't get to be a part of or understand, right? You just get the end product. And yes, there might be some ridiculous tasks, but let's for a second just step back and just assume that everybody is trying to do the best they can. And maybe they aren't making the best decision, and maybe you do know better or could do better. But again, if you just step back and say, well, maybe they're doing the best they can, they probably are, that helps us internally to go from a heart of, oh, they are, to, okay, there's some compassion there, and there's grace. Right? If you think about, your spouse or friends, how often do we snap the quick judgments rather than thinking maybe they're doing the best they can, and maybe they're worn out and they're tired? Right? So how can we show grace first rather than judgment? Right? It starts to help us grow, and we start to see others in a different light. At my other job, for those of you who don't know, I also do training and nutrition. But at my other job, we used to have this member at the club who a lot of people didn't like to work with. She had a very short fuse. She could be mean to other members. She could be mean to other employees. But she was in one of my classes, and she liked me because she liked the music that I played. And she didn't like to do big events when we would do big events. So one day she showed up to the class, and it was part of a bigger event, and she's like, I don't want to do that. And she threw a tantrum, and she didn't want to quit her membership, though. Even the general manager numerous times said, hey, you know what, maybe this isn't the place for you, right? But she did not want to leave. And so I'm like, you know what, I've got an hour free. How about I'll just do a one-on-one session with her? So fine. And so I did. And in that time, I found out her life story. And she had been through a lot. And she's had a very hard life, a lot of cancer, a lot of other health issues, family issues, work issues. And so as we're doing all this work, like I remember we were working on triceps, on the cable press down. And I just remember her, so she's working her arms, but she's also crying at the same time. Because all those experiences has shaped her into it's a me against the world mentality. And that doesn't mean that she's right or justified in treating people the way that she did. But I started to understand why. And it helped me be able to give grace. And rather than, being quick to judge her, or being like, why would you say that? Why would you do that? That's just not human, right? To be like, okay, I understand. And then I could help others to be able to help her when they worked with her as well. And it worked so well. And it was helpful for me to understand her, but it was also helpful for her just to be able to process some of the stuff that was going on. So instead of saying, that teacher's a moron, or that coach doesn't know what they're doing, or that kid is dumb, because all that teaches our kids to do is to judge others quickly when they hear that from us. Instead, maybe we start with reorienting them to, okay, let's just start with assuming that everybody's trying to do the best that they can, no matter their age. And some are limited in certain ways, right? Some have more common sense than others. Some are better in math. I'm not very good at math. So we all have different strengths and different abilities, but let's all assume that no matter where we are on the different scales, right, that we're all trying to do the best we can. And so judgment says things like, well, I blame you, person at the help desk or counter, for the inconvenience that you've caused about my flight. So let me go off on you. And grace says, well, I'm going to try and step back and see it from your perspective that you can't actually control most of this stuff. Judgment says, you are a horrible server. And grace says, perhaps you're short-staffed, probably are. Maybe you're new, but you're probably just trying to do the best you can also. Judgment says, my kid doesn't like their teacher, so that teacher must not be very good. Well, grace says, maybe the teacher actually really does care about my kid and didn't get into teaching just for the high pay. And they want the kids to do and develop the best that they can. So how can I listen to and maybe partner with the teacher rather than simply tell my kid that the teacher is an idiot? Judgment says, when somebody wrongs you, that you didn't do what I wanted, so now I'm going to make your life harder. Or not talk to you, or whatever it is. And grace says, well, God gives grace to me when I screw up for the 1,000th time on the same thing, so maybe I should give grace too. But help them see it from the other person's perspective. And it starts with us being able to see it from the other person's perspective. And then we teach that to our kids. And so maybe it's the new kid at school, and you just have the conversation. Are the other kids being nice to them? Maybe they are, maybe not. Okay, well, at some point, you're probably going to be the new kid. Whether it's a new school, whether it's in college, whether it's at work. So at some point, you're going to be the new kid in a new situation. How do you want people to make you feel? Doesn't mean you have to be best friends, but let's just at least be welcoming. Or maybe it's possessions, right? Things that they have or don't have. Right? She wears this, or they don't have that. Okay. Well, maybe that's their style. And life would be pretty boring if we all wore the same thing. So let's let people enjoy their creativity. Maybe it's somebody at school or on the team is being mean. Okay, well, instead of putting that kid down in front of friends, maybe we go with, okay, they should know better, but often kids lash out because they're hurting, so they hurt others, or they're insecure. Okay, so maybe you still need to inform teachers or the coach, right, to deal with it, but maybe you also pray for them, because there's probably things going on in their heart that they don't know how to deal with. and just drop in grace as judgment gives way to grace. Or maybe it's someone around you does something stupid, makes a mistake, and it's totally okay to not tell others or share it on social media. Because would you want that done to you? Right? We just start being dispensers and giving grace. Most famous verse probably in all the Bible, right? John 3:16. And we're going to put in the context. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. And again, this is groundbreaking at that time because he's speaking to people that would associate God loved Israel. The world was not who God loved, right? They were against God. Jesus says, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. He goes on, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. And I broke it up like this because we see judgment. But whose role is that? It's God's, right? Christ came to give grace. We follow him in giving grace. That's our role in the world, is to show grace, not to overstep. God will deal with those who wrong you. God will deal with what people have done. But that's God's role, is in judgment. Ours is to show grace. And it's so easy, again, to be like, oh, yeah, I agree with that. But then it's so hard as soon as you walk out and somebody cuts you off in traffic. Or your meal after church, where you're sitting there because you're not in the info class, and you're not getting your water. And so let's teach our kids to care for those who are different and not to shame people. Help them to run to those who are hurting, not away from them. And help them to look at others in the eye and see the humanity in their soul with hurts and dreams and anxieties and frustrations in the person across from them. Because when we do that, we connect with the other person. And in a world where people feel it's crazy and we feel alone and we feel isolated, connection is everything. Just to know that somebody sees you. Let's teach our kids to do that. And so do your kids and do we live in grace or do we live in judgment? Pillar 3, raise great kids by teaching them to put grace over judgment. Judgment is left to God. We're called to show grace. And when we do that, we don't just follow Christ. We also find favor with men and women around us. Let's pray. God, as we're here this morning, we thank you that you are a God of grace. You are holy, and you do bring judgment. You do bring consequences. There's heaven, there is hell. But for us, you call us to show grace to others. And so help us to be bold and stubborn in showing grace. Help us to recognize when we do need to show grace. Help us to see the humanity in the other person's eyes. Help us to realize how we can be more like you, because you have such an amazing way of connecting with people, whether it's a Samaritan woman or the person on the side of a road. You're so quick to be able to show grace and see their humanity. And so help us to do that as well. And we ask that as you do, that our kids would see that, they would grow in that, and that they would find not just wisdom, but that they would find favor with God and man. In Christ's name, amen.